Bonsoir, good evening. Bienvenue à cet événement sur les élections européennes. Je vais me présenter moi-même, je suis Ruth Dassonneville, je suis au département de sciences politiques à l'Université de Montréal. Je suis aussi titulaire de la Chaire de recherche du Canada en démocratie électorale, un des co-organisateurs de cet événement avec le Centre pour l'étude de la citoyenneté démocratique ainsi que le Centre Jean Monnet. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here for this event on the European elections that are coming up this week. We decided to put together this panel of experts because these are really exciting elections. There's a lot coming up and there's a real interest in this election, not just in Europe and European countries, but also abroad and in the Canadian context as well. There's a lot at stake, we think, in this particular election. You can think of the fact that there's a couple of types of parties that seem to be gaining popularity in many of these European countries. We might see a rise of some Eurosceptic parties, we might see a rise of populist parties, and we might also see the effects in terms of vote shares of the mobilization around the environment, with student strikes all over Europe and the environmental issue gaining salience in many European countries. So this is going to be an exciting election, and we've brought together a set of experts on European politics and public opinion in the European Union, experts on radical right-wing parties, experts on green parties, and experts on political communication and election campaigns. And in what's going to follow, they're going to be addressing many of the issues that you're all wondering about and about what is going to be happening in this upcoming election. Before starting the debate and before handing over to our panelists here, we're going to be talking about what they think are the main issues in this election. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to kind of set the stage and to give a short intro about what is really at stake at this election, what these elections are about, and who will be elected in this election. What are Europeans voting for in the upcoming elections? And to do so, I am not going to give you an intro to EU institutions, because that would take way too long. I'm just going to be focusing on what people are going to be voting for and how the vote that is going to take place this week is going to affect a number of different institutions at the EU level. There's obviously going to be consequences for the European Parliament, because the election is an election for choosing members for the European Parliament. So 751 members of the European Parliament will be elected in this election. The last election was 5 years ago. It's been a while, a lot has changed since in many of these European countries. The elections are taking place between Thursday and Sunday. In each of those 28 member states, that still includes the UK, given that the UK has not left the European Union yet, they still have to take part in this election. So just to give you an overview, a couple of countries are going to vote on Thursday, then there's going to be more on Friday, but most countries are going to have their election on Sunday. So Sunday is really when we're going to have the election results coming in and the results being counted. Different countries have different numbers of members, and that is roughly proportional, not completely, because obviously small countries as well need a certain amount of representatives in the European Parliament. There's plans already for when the UK leaves the European Union, how seats are going to be redistributed, but for now, the European Union is sticking to the 751 members, which includes lots of members from the big countries, such as Germany, Italy, France, and also all the other countries who have more or less MEPs. The election has to follow some sort of proportional rules. So that's kind of an important thing to know when you're going to be seeing the results coming in from this election. All countries have to choose their MEPs by proportional rules. rules. They can decide themselves what kind of rules they're going to be using. But countries like the UK and France also have to choose their MEPs according to proportional rules. That obviously results in an advantage for some of these smaller parties, the challenger parties, like the extreme right or like the Green parties. They're obviously going to benefit from these kinds of rules. It is also important to know that in each of those 21 member states, citizens are voting for the parties that they know. They're voting for national parties or regional parties, national or regional candidates. However, just an example randomly picked from Belgium, where people are voting for the national parties, the parties that they know well and the candidates that they know well from their own setting. Those parties, however, and the MEPs, once elected, will organize themselves in the European Parliament, and they organize in certain groups according to their ideologies. It's social democratic parties working together in the European Parliament, Christian democratic parties working together, liberal parties, Green parties, they're all forming groups in the European Parliament, where they're not presented as such on the ballots that people are going to be seeing when they enter the voting booths this week. There's lots of predictions on what might happen in this upcoming election and how the different groups that are in Parliament might do better or worse in this election than they did 5 years ago. Those predictions are affected by different sorts of indicators, and variables are included in those models. Those include how parties in each of those countries are faring over time. A couple of these parties, like Green parties, are doing well in the polls, so they might gain votes. But in addition, in these kinds of predictions, in terms of which groups are going to do better or worse this time, or have more seats this time than they had last time, you should also take into account that those parties strategically pick the group that they're going to be a member of in the European Parliament. So there might be some shifts as well in which parties are going to be a member of which groups, and at the front of the Eurosceptic parties in particular, there's efforts to put together a new kind of group to work together in the European Parliament. It is not only the European Parliament that is at stake in this election. The European Commission, as well as an institution that is going to be affected directly by this election. Currently, the European Commission is headed by Juncker from Luxembourg, but that is going to change after this election. And if you want to know who is going to be in charge of the European Commission, then you should look at the Spitzenkandidaten. The main groups in the European Parliament have put forward names for candidates who will, if that party does well in this election, who will be the candidates to be the president of the Commission. So depending on what parties fare well, one of these candidates might turn out to be in charge of the Commission after these elections. It is not only the candidate that's got the most support and that finds a majority in the European Parliament to support the candidacy that will be elected. That candidate should also get the agreement of a third institution, the European Council. The European Council is basically the heads of state and government in the different countries, the heads of government in different countries coming together. They have to approve of whomever is proposed as the president of the European Commission. And there as well, there's some changes coming up. So there's a limited number of countries where we might change in who's going to be in that European Commission, because a couple of countries, basically 2 countries here, will have elections on exactly the same day. Belgium and Lithuania. So there's going to be some change at the level of the council as well. Furthermore, there's more elections coming up pretty soon. Denmark's got elections coming up. Austria is going to have elections soon now as well. So there's going to be more change coming up in the next couple of months at the level of the council. Also because what's going to happen in this European Parliament election will definitely affect national level politics in each of these countries. And if some of these parties, fringe parties, are doing really well, that might put pressure on the other parties to perhaps call elections. To sum up, what is at stake in this election? The European Parliament is up for grabs. There's 751 MEPs that will have to be elected. The Spitzenkandidaten in particular are both looking out for, because One of them is going to be leading the head of the president of the new commission. Furthermore, there's going to be some minor changes in national level politics, but at that level, there's more to come in the next couple of months. With a really short intro, but lots of information on the elections and what to expect in this election, I think I set the stage, and it's now time to hand over to our panelists who are going to be discussing about what, according to them, are the main issues and how this election might or might not change the future of the European Union. So on that note, I'll hand over to my colleague, Laurie Beaudonnet, and she will introduce the panelists to you.
So, to talk about these issues in this very exciting election with us tonight, we have 4 specialists coming from, well, across the Atlantic and also down south of Canada from the US. So directly on my left is Katjana Gatterman. She's assistant professor at the University at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. She's a specialist in public opinion and political campaign, specifically in the European Union. Then Joost is associate professor in the communication science department of the University of Amsterdam. Joost specialized in political journalism and also the quality of democracy and how media and parties play together in this regard. Next to Joost, Stockemer is full professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's a specialist of the extreme right in Europe and also political participation and political representation. And next to Daniel is Jae-Jae, who is associate professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh and the director of the European Studies Center and the Jean Monnet Center. She is a specialist of political party strategies, in particular new and small parties and how these challenges might change the way electoral democracy work out. So just to give you a brief overview of how we're going to proceed tonight, first each panelist is going to have a 5-minute inaugural statement to answer the first question. Then we will allow them to respond to each other and then go on further with a couple of questions. And then we will open it up to the floor for questions. So you will be able to use the microphone up there, or you can also live tweet your question, and then we will convey it through the microphone like this. So without further ado, then the first question is, in which ways would the election change the future of Europe?
Thank you very much for having me here. I would like to talk about the Spitzenkandidat, which Ruth already mentioned. So it's actually a German word for lead candidates. And it's really about the pan-European lead candidates. These are nominated by the European party families, not the national party. And it was first done that way in 2014. And it was the initiative of the European Parliament back then, which interpreted the Treaty of Lisbon in its favor, because there were some changes in the treaty which stated that the Council, in the nomination of the candidate for Commission President, have to take into account the election results, and ultimately the European Parliament will elect the nominee. So the European Parliament said early on, okay, in 2014, let's encourage all political groups to put forward lead candidates. And the idea was that they actually raise the awareness of voters' interest, of course, to work against polling turnout, and also to increase or maintain the legitimacy of the European Parliament and ultimately the Commission, because the Parliament holds the Commission accountable. So that was the first time, and we've seen, Ruth has already told us, Jean-Claude Juncker, he was back then the lead candidate for the EPP, the People's Party, and he was eventually also nominated by the council and ultimately elected. Now, for this time round, the parliament actually mentioned the resolution in 2014 that was a success. It doesn't say much more, but it's of course when you look at, one of the lead candidates was elected commission president in the end. But what I would argue, we don't really know yet whether it's really a success because the effects on voters are actually not clear. So I've done some research on the one hand into media coverage, so looked across several European countries how much attention actually these lead candidates got. We have some variation across countries, so in those countries which actually had lead candidates, like France and Germany, they paid comparatively more attention than, for instance, the United Kingdom. But we don't also have much comparison because it was the first time. We cannot say that it was a lot or only little attention. This year we'll be able, after we systematically analyze this from the current campaigns, we'll be able to draw a comparison. Also, I've done research into voter opinions and recognition. So we asked voters in the Netherlands to what extent they actually know these candidates and can also align them with their political preference. And it turns out that only few voters can actually make sense of these candidates. They only focused on the big three, basically, for the biggest parties. But even there, voters had a hard time, and they needed actually to have or regularly follow the news and also have some information about the EU at hand. So those who had some more knowledge, they could make sense of it, but others not. So that is, of course, something which is influenced or which is not fully set in place. So I would like to make a few pointers for this election, actually. So, as I already said, we are now interested whether there's actually some more attention also by the media paid to it. Since we saw last time, okay, there was actually one of the lead candidates became commission president. We have to say, however, as we talk about it later as well, that still is not clear. As I said, that the council still needs to nominate, the majorities are not clear, so we'll have to come back to that issue after the elections as well. But in terms of voters, we had again some TV debates. That was also last time the case. These are, of course, there's some difficulties. First of all, these debates are originally in English mostly. One candidate this time spoke in French that had to be translated, and also national television station, they then translate also in real time, so that the viewers at home, be that in Sweden or Slovakia, can also follow. But that is, of course, also an issue because you cannot really see the personality of the politician if he or she doesn't speak in their own language, for instance, or also is translated into another language. So that is, of course, a bit different. Then, of course, you need to be aware that these debates are followed by people who are anyways highly interested in the campaign. So it's perhaps difficult to reach those who are not yet interested in the elections or actually want to have a plan to but then it's important that other media also talk about that. And also we have to talk about political parties. So also some research into election campaign posters. And last time, for instance, parties in the Netherlands and Italy, they haven't really had the lead candidates of the European lead candidates on the election posters. So how can voters then recognize them? There's of course still the national lead candidates, which is a bit paradox. That's at the same time, voters of course have their national candidates. So these are a few things to look out for also, or to keep in mind actually this time. Generally, I think it's a positive procedure because I don't see that it does do much harm in that sense, but it's still a young procedure. Voters need to be socialized, candidates and parties. So I don't think that it will be a massive improvement to last time. But
yeah, thank you, Laurie. Yeah. So the question you asked was, will these elections, these European parliamentary elections of this week, will they change the future of the EU? And I have a short answer and a long answer to that. The short answer is no. And that is basically, well, you know, I mean, of course, the European Parliament has become more important in recent years, more powerful also, but to shape the future of the EU in this European parliamentary election, no. The long answer, that is still no. But given, of course, the limitations of the European Parliament, I would still note at least one very important thing about how the winds may have changed. And yeah, the main takeaway point is, I think that so if you're pro-EU, there is something to be well, you know, positive about. In terms of the pro-EU forces have, I think, yeah, strengthened perhaps as a byproduct of recent developments, and I will just briefly elaborate on that. So, what we have seen in recent years is that rather anti-EU forces, Eurosceptical forces, have been pretty strong as a byproduct of all kinds of developments, such as the Brexit, such as the immigration crisis, all kinds of elements that seemed very much to blow winds in the sails of Eurosceptic political parties. Brexit was, of course, an unprecedented success for those who wish to work for the EU in general and in the UK in particular. And the immigration crisis was a gift sent from heaven to all kinds of anti-immigration parties, in particular the ensuing chaos in Greece and Italy, and all kinds of fear-mongering that ensued. So very clearly anti-EU forces, I mean, partly simply as a byproduct, but still they have been pretty strong, which did not bode very well for the 2019 elections. But then it seems that at least a little bit the winds have changed in this respect. In terms that there is still very clear, strong and articulate anti-EU forces, and these parties, as you have seen also in the slide put by Ruth, very Eurosceptic forces will very likely win, be enforced, and also will probably be very strong at obstructing whatever they can. However, there is also a pro-EU side that has become stronger and more confident as far as I'm concerned. And that is partly perhaps a more ongoing evolution that we have seen also at the country level, where you see an evolution of pro and anti-EU forces fighting it out over time. In some countries much earlier, such as Denmark and France, already since the 70s and 80s, whereas in other countries, as in my country, the Netherlands, very recently so, but partly also as a byproduct. And then as a byproduct of, well, three recent developments, I would say, and I will finish with that. First of all, again, the Brexit. I think anyone who has witnessed the development of Brexit in the last 2 years, I mean, has seen that it's not going that well in all respects with the Brexiteers in their saga, leading to perhaps also to force pro-EU forces in basically most other EU countries. Second of all, we have Macron, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who will lead an army of liberal pro-EU representatives into the European Parliament, perhaps joining the Liberals. And then we have third, also of course, the salience of climate change. That will be in the hearts of the minds of many Europeans, even if they're not, these issues are not always very visible in the campaign in every country at every time, but still that also gives us some kind of byproduct, more force to pro-EU forces. Adding up to, that's my final observations, adding up to that the center-right and center-left may well lose their majority and will have to lean on other parties. They will probably look at two rather pro-EU forces, the Liberals and the Greens. And in that sense, it seems at least that the winds have changed a little bit. Will these elections change the future of the EU? Again, short answer is no, and the long answer is still no, but maybe there is a little bit of change.
Okay, I will pick up on what Joost said. Okay, what will change? I would say not that much. First, turnout will stay low. EU elections, the last 2 times they were a little more than 40%. It will probably go slightly up, but I think not because people are more interested in voting per se, but because many countries have scheduled in other elections with the EP elections. For example, in Belgium you have national elections, in Germany and Spain you have local elections. So there will be some countries where turnout will go up, and maybe in general we'll have a slight increase, but it will be probably due to scheduling of elections. Did the election become more important for the media, for parties, for voters? The answer is also no. I follow very closely Germany and France, and if you look, the election only has really secondary importance in the news. They're not on the first page or even like the odd story, but there's a lot of other things that are discussed, and we are like less than a week before. So this idea that these elections are second order still holds. Second order means less important. But there will be some changes. Will they be detrimental? No. One of the changes, and Joost has said it, we have always had, since the existence of the European Parliament, a majority of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats. It's probably the first time that these majority will form. It's not 100% sure, but the polls look like that. So that means the 2 main pillars of European integration will no longer have a majority. Is this detrimental? Probably not, because not all the votes they lose go to extreme parties. The 2 small parties, the Liberals and the Green Party, are both expected to win. This can have relatively interesting, less important, but still some important repercussions, that we might have a different coalition. So it might be that the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Green Party. And it's unclear, but there might be shifting forces. Is this important? I would say not that much, because I think the big dividing line is not between what we have had before between, let's say, Social Democrats and Conservatives. It's between populists and pro-European forces. And if we, for example, if you look at the pro and the anti-EU forces, for example, there's something in Europe, it's called Pulse of Europe. It's like in every city they have like events where they kind of praise Europe and they kind of raise awareness of Europe. And that's basically all the main parties are supporting that. And who's against it is the fringe parties. But I think for the overall development of the EU, or even what's decided in the parliament, the influence is small. But nevertheless, we see, I mean, the center is basically losing and small parties are gaining. And we also will see gains on the radical left and, of course, on the radical right. Will they be detrimental? No. I mean, the radical right will, at most, in my opinion, get around 20%, the radical left, at most 10%. We still have a solid 70% majority. So this, I mean, I don't see that this will really trigger any changes in how Europe works, but there we have some small changes within the parliament and also probably what makes up the majority. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Ruth and Laurie for having me here and for this discussion. I will follow my two previous colleagues in also saying no, and that's all I have to say, no. But to elaborate a bit on what has been said, will we see major changes? No. But as Daniel just said, I think we will see some changes sort of around the fringes. Just to put into a bit more context what's already been said. So since 1979, which is when we had the first direct elections to the European Parliament, the Socialists and the Conservative and the Christian Democrats have held a majority. And so what will change likely is that those two parties, which have been sort of the pillars of European integration, are likely to lose their majority. So that is an important change. However, as has already been said, with all of the other pro-European groups that will join them, the Greens and the Liberals, for example, the pro-European parties in the European Parliament will still have well over a majority. And so while we may see some changes within that bloc, we still will have, as has been said and probably will be said again this evening, the pro-European forces within the European Parliament will still hold the majority, although that bloc may look very different, and what the conversation looks like within that bloc may change. A second change that we may see, although again not sort of a cataclysmic change, is again we will, as has been mentioned before, see a rise of support for what are typically called the Eurosceptic parties, populist parties, the radical right. They go by many different names. And again, as has been said, polls show them winning maybe 20-25%. So again, I think those numbers are important to keep in perspective, that we're still going to have a majority that's pro-Europe, although what may grow is that anti-EU or Eurosceptic force. Something that's important also, I think, to note within that populist right-wing anti-Europe group is that they're very fragmented. And so I think even though they may gain, they're not a coordinated group. In other words, there's lots of dissension within the group on issues as diverse as the economy, as the relationship with Russia, etc. So there's no guarantee that even if that 20%, 25% gets elected, that they're going to behave and vote together. So the more fragmented and less coordinated, they are, the less likely they are to have much of an influence. And I think the third point that I'd like to make in terms of to support my no is that there still is generally a support among EU citizens for European integration. While there, of course, is support for these Eurosceptic anti-EU parties, there still is, that feeling is not universal. And there still is support. Recent surveys have shown that between 50 and 65% of voters would like to see more European integration within the EU. And so that's, again, important to keep that in mind, that while there is support for some of these anti-EU parties, that by no means is a universal feeling among voters in Europe. And so I think the final point that I would make is that there's also, in terms of when voters are going to vote, right? When they're asked and have been asked in recent public opinion surveys, what are you thinking about when you're going to vote? And as perhaps what we might be led to think, given what we've perhaps read in the media and sort of what these far-right parties have been talking about, that the major issues when voters are going to vote is immigration, right, is globalization. and these forces and how they're influencing Europe. But recent public opinion surveys have actually shown that the issues that voters are most interested in are things like inequality, healthcare, unemployment, climate change. Immigration is maybe 6th or 7th, depending on the country. And so that's, I think, important to keep in mind, that when voters are actually thinking about who they're going to support, they're thinking about sort of typical domestic type issues that influence every single election, right? And that's not sort of these earth-shattering, huge changes, but things that we're all concerned about and that voters everywhere are concerned about as well. And so these elections, in some ways, right, are looking like national elections in terms of the things that voters are interested in. And so just to kind of come back to my no, to agree with my colleagues, that I think we are going to see some changes, but at the end of the day, we still are going to have pro-European forces having the dominant position within the EU. That there are voters across the board in terms of their support for the EU or less support, and that voters are interested in a whole host of issues that are not just sort of these kind of lightning issues that some of the populist parties are.
Thank you, Jae-Jae. Thank you, everyone, for this inaugural statement. So before we move on to the next question, do you want to react to anything that one of the other candidates said?
Sure. Very quickly, just to reiterate, the European Parliament, they don't have legislative power. It's the Commission that suggests laws, and hence it also limits a lot of the influence of these fringe parties and the radical right and the radical left, because they cannot really propose their own laws or their own propositions. And since the European Commission will remain very pro-EU, we will not see any change in the proposals that arrive at the parliamentary floor. This also shows that for the overall Europe, the impact will be relatively limited.
I just wanted to come back to the comment about media coverage about the elections. And it is indeed true that media pay less attention to European Parliament elections compared to national elections, for instance. But we also see, colleagues have shown that over time there is more attention. So there's more politicization, but also media paying more attention. And my research shows also regular attention outside elections to European affairs. So, and we have yet to see how this time maybe it stagnates, we don't know what's back, but there also is a bit of focus, especially on these populist, radical right, of the media, because it's negative news, conflict. They like these sort of news and tend to focus more on that, and not so, for instance, on policy positions or something like that, which would also give voters more information on what's actually at stake.
So actually, I wanted to follow up on Katjana, what you were talking about in terms of, in some ways, this disconnect between sort of campaigns in the member states, right, in France and Germany, etc., and then also the lead candidates as well. And I thought it quite interesting in following some of the campaigns of some of the Green parties, for example. You see the national campaigns, for example, in France. They have their lead candidates. They're all talking very much about climate change and global issues that are very much relevant across the board, with no mention actually at all of the lead candidates. And so I just wonder actually to ask you how you see the sort of the future of this, right? So how can, right, the idea of this lead candidate, as you talked about and as Ruth talked about as well, was really as a way to kind of raise the salience of it and sort of make these elections perhaps more European, right? If everyone that's a social democrat is going to vote for the same candidate effectively, although in practice they're voting for their own parties, and we haven't quite seen that yet, at least in the two elections, 2014 when this started, and then now we're seeing this not as much as well. So I just wonder if you have a thought in terms of how this process can be advanced so that it's realizing the role that it
Thank you. Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's really low there is campaigns by the candidates themselves, and they are very active also on Twitter or Facebook or other social media. But yeah, the support by national parties varies also. There are some parties who do not campaign with them at all. Others do as well. Depends also on who the candidate is, on how pro-European they, for instance, are. So what needs to happen in the future is that parties clearly tell their voters, by the way, if you vote for us, you get this candidates. But that is of course also a process that parties also have to socialize with and accept that it's going to happen. And we have to see, it depends also a bit what will happen now with the elections, who will actually be commissioned. So if none of the candidates actually will be nominated by the council, and in that case also the parliament accepts that, so maybe the procedure might not be used next time. So there's a lot of ifs and conditions basically what will happen next. But yeah, there needs to be more socialization with the candidates at the front in future elections.
Yeah, just to underline what you just said, Katjana, about the news media. It is actually two things. One, it is absolutely true that there is a lot more attention to national elections than to European elections. And two, it actually matters also for vote choice. Let me briefly elaborate with an anecdote. In my country, in the Netherlands, in 1999, there was famously just one newscast about the European election during the entire campaign. And that newscast was on the day before the election saying that probably turnout is going to be low. So this is an illustration of how poorly covered these European elections were. Fast forward 20 years, it has become more, it has become also perhaps a little bit better in terms of nuance. But my second point is it also matters. Just two examples. One is the quite substantial amount that the far right tends to get in news media matters. As several researchers have repeatedly shown that media attention to far-right leaders, their issues, their parties, basically enhances the vote for these parties in various contexts. And second, it has also been shown in research that particular framing, so positive framing of the EU, also in terms of, in general, but also in terms of talking about the benefits of the EU for the member state, actually seems to reduce the vote for Eurosceptic parties among those who are actually exposed to such news content. So, in brief, there is very little coverage, and it is very much skewed. And secondly, that matters.
So I would like maybe to pick up on the thing that one thing that some of you mentioned, the Grand Coalition. So as it has been said, traditionally the European Parliament works through a coalition between the main center-right political group, the European People's Party, and the center-left, the Social Democrats. Parties, sometimes one of the two is strong enough to pass some laws through alliance with the Liberal group. But more basically, the Parliament has been working on for years through this coalition between the center-left and the center-right. And as you mentioned, for the first time in the history of the European Parliament, this might come to an end, meaning that one of the two groups might lose the majority. So I just would like to hear you on whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, first democracy and second the EU. You seem the least convinced by
I mean, I would say again, it doesn't matter. Because there's not that much coverage and there's not that much awareness actually who makes the decision. It's not only the European, you also have to remember, the European Parliament is only one out of the 3 different bodies. And so I don't think even the decisions that will come out will be that much different, because most decisions, there's no, I mean, among the pro-European parties, a lot of legislative proposals passed with a large majority. So if you don't have the same opposition as you have in national parliaments, so I really don't think there will be a really big change in perceptions, because if you ask Europeans who is in charge of the European Parliament, I think very few will know. If you ask, I mean, what's the Grand Coalition and what do the other parties do, very few will know. So I don't really think that this changes anything in the perception and changes anything in how democracy is perceived.
Well, yes, I agree with my colleague here. I would say that I think it's actually, I'll be provocative and say I think it's actually a good thing for democracy, in the sense that the reason that these parties, right, these are the major social democratic socialist parties and the Christian Democrats and some conservatives are not winning votes, is because they're not being responsive to voters, right? They're not offering things to voters that voters agree with, that voters are looking for something else, whether that's further to the left, on climate change, on the economy, etc., whether they're voting for the Greens or voting for further left-wing parties, or if it's or on the right. And so, in the sense that this is a demonstration of kind of how democratic politics work, right? In other words, if parties are not offering voters something that they agree with, then voters have another option. And I think the fact that we're seeing that these parties, these national parties that belong to the Social Democratic group and to the European People's Party are losing votes, right? I think that's a signal that they're not being representative, but that voters, if they hopefully stay in and actually vote, as has been mentioned, turnout tends to be low in these elections, they have different parties to vote for that better represent them on the issues that they find important. So I actually think from a democratic perspective, we're actually seeing multi-party democracy at work.
Yeah, I would definitely also, for the sake of discussion, also back to differ on 2 points. One is exactly what you say about that it's good to open power decision making, cooperating up to more players, so as to enhance responsiveness. And more generally, coming from or living in a city that has been ruled by the Social Democrats longer than the Communist Party was in power in the USSR, we know that it's not good that just 1 or 2 parties are in power for a very long time, for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't really matter which party. But there's also, I think, a second reason, and also in that terms, I beg to differ with you a little bit, Daniel, and that is that it wouldn't matter whether, for example, the Greens would be included in decision making or not. I think, okay, center right, center left, liberals, Greens, they all tend to be pro-EU, more or less. But then still, there's all kinds of things like international treatments, privacy, also attitudes towards big corporations, also the urgency with which climate change issues are tackled. I think it might make a big difference, actually, to what extent or whether the Greens are actually part of solutions or not, even if they're small. Just as an example of that, it might actually very much or to some extent also in terms of outcomes, no matter how small, matter. That this two-party coalition is going to be broken up.
I guess I disagree, because I mean, it would imply that there are different laws coming from different proposals coming from the Commission. And I don't see this. I mean, I would agree with you if there would actually be a possibility to actively introduce laws. But since this is not the case in the European framework, I really don't see how. I mean, singular decisions might be impacted, and there might be no more negotiation between the Parliament and the Commission. But I think it's relatively marginal.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of points. In addition, I agree with the main things mentioned. I think, also Jae-Jae said, I think it's actually good if there's also changes, so that coalitions have to be found more ad hoc, rather than having the grand coalition always be there and then the majority is clear, that depending on the issue, you have to fight for majorities. Because also that will potentially, generate media attention, because media love conflict, and if there's a bit more political conflict in the Parliament, social media report more about it, and ultimately citizens then also learn a bit more what their representatives actually do.
You also like conflicts, yes. No, and I think just to follow up, not only media likes conflict, but voters like conflict, right? Lots of studies have shown that when there's disagreement, voters actually pay more attention, right? And they actually are better able to identify issues, identify parties' positions, etc. So a bit of conflict is actually not necessarily a bad thing as well. And conflict not only generates interest, can increase turnout, right? If voters see that there's actually a difference between what's on offer from the different parties. And so a bit of conflict, right? Not to the point where there's gridlock, right? That's obviously sort of where conflict can cause major problems, wherever you get to that point. But a bit of disagreement, and not just sort of politics as usual, and which is often, what we often think about with the grand coalition, can actually generate interest and have some positive effects as well.
Okay, well, you like conflict, so let's go ahead with another question. As some of you also mentioned that the far-right parties are, well, first, they're likely to gain more seats in the forthcoming election, but also the media and the campaign has been very much in many different countries about the so-called threat of the extreme right at the European level. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit more about the fact that the far-right parties have been organizing themselves at the European level. Just the last weekend, there was a big meeting in Italy with the National Front, the Italian League, and so on and so forth. So I would like to hear you a bit about whether this has been a big issue in the campaign, and also how you see this is going in the next month or years. What is the future of this European extreme right?
So I think this is obviously something that's on everyone's minds because there is, as we've also mentioned, sort of the rise of these parties and increasing support. And as Laurie just mentioned, Salvini from the League in Italy gathered a team of fellow travelers on this past weekend in Milan. And the media has made it very clear, or tried to, that it's a very unified group. But even within that group, not all of them, not all of the leaders of these parties were part of this meeting. And there's a lot, as I mentioned and as others mentioned as well, there is quite a bit of disagreement among the group around support for Russia as one of them. There have been parties that are part of the that are part of this far right group that have distanced themselves somewhat from Salvini and Le Pen in France, etc. because of this. Some of the Scandinavian far-right parties, the Polish Law and Justice Party has also made it very clear that they will not join a party that involves the pro-Putin far-right. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind as we think about sort of perhaps the threat from the far-right. As of right now, as has been mentioned, all of the national parties, once they're elected, form party groups, and we've been talking about these. And right now, there seems to be perhaps 3 different Eurosceptic groups, again, divided over some of these issues, even though they're all somewhat Eurosceptic or anti-EU. And again, that makes it harder to really change the agenda and to really move any sort of, make any major changes if they're not all in the same group and if they're all not voting together. The one thing that they all do agree on is that they want to change the EU from within. Many of these far-right parties did support some version of a Brexit, whether it was an exit in the Netherlands or Brexit in France or Fix-It in Finland. But now most of them, in fact, all of them are really not supportive of this anymore because they've watched what's unraveled or not unraveled in the UK, right? We still don't have a Brexit. And so have really kind of backed off of that position and have said we really need to change the EU from within, right? Which in some ways is sort of code for trying to weaken the EU as much as possible from within the European Parliament, if that is even possible. The problem is that there's no real agreement on how to do that. How do these parties that are not necessarily organized and coordinated, how do they actually go about doing that? So while they all may agree on lessening the power of the supranational organization that is the EU, they really have no, not only agreement on the way forward, it's not clear what that way forward is. And so I think we have to kind of recognize that on the one hand, while they are coming together in some ways and there's increasing support, what happens next is perhaps less clear because of the fragmentation and as well as disagreement from
a couple of things. Even within the same party, sometimes they join different party families. It shows, the same national party. It really shows how fragmented they are. I want to come back to another point you made with the media. And, there's a famous quote from Marie Le Pen, which just summarizes this a little bit. I don't care what the media talks about as long as they talk about us, about our topics. I think that's a little bit what we see. And the more they talk about them, the more they're the public attention. And I also think that compared to other parties, for example, this famous meeting in Milano, somehow was in the news everywhere. Wasn't really that important in my opinion, but it shows that they still get their fair share of media attention. I think that can, to a small degree, I won't overestimate it, contribute to the success. But also, they get the same disproportionate media attention. You just have to look at the US. Everybody talks about Trump every day. It's not that strong in the European context, but I think we talk too much about this party, and implicitly they benefit. And also to put this into perspective, we have kind of a populist type right now. You can look everywhere, populist gain. And I think Europe is part of it, and it's not specific what we see to the European Parliament. What we see, the results we will see will reflect what we'll see, or what we have seen in a lot of national parliaments. And I don't think that compared to what their vote share in national parliaments is the radical right will gain in the European Parliament. But if you compare their vote share across Europe, in the national parliament, in the European Parliament, I think it will be relatively similar, maybe even lower. So I think that's also to put things into perspective.
So Daniel mentioned Jean-Marie Le Pen. So I cannot be left behind, of course, so I will mention Marine Le Pen. Two things. First of all, to underline the scattered history of the far right trying to cooperate. There's this anecdote of the Italian far right representative actually calling Romanians out on having making crime a way of life, after which the Romanians actually left the fraction and the whole fraction fell apart. That used to be the core level of integration of the far right, say 25 years ago. Then in 2015, they really pulled it together with Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen having une romance, and which led to actually the love baby of 17.5 million euros that they actually got of EU funding. So they are on a learning project, but it's still very difficult, I think, to reiterate and highlight the fractions or the fragmentation on the far right. But I think, as a second point, I think underlying all this are issues of immigration and integration. That a lot of European voters are very much concerned about. A lot of voters actually wanting to have an Australian or Canadian immigration model, as they call it. And as long as that is not put in place, or at least issues here are not taken care of in the eyes of those voters, this large segment of the electorate, this tide will keep on rising, in my view, with clearly as a byproduct again, risk for the EU of, well, basically almost existential proportion. So in that sense, I think the far right, I mean, even if they're very scattered, and even if they're, well, they cannot do much more than obstruct, but still, I mean, there is a huge potential of danger for the EU, in my view.
Yeah, a couple of comments in addition to that. Actually, to the media, that's perhaps one thing. They focus on the European parties or parties in other countries domestically, so that you can see some Europeanization. And of course, also they have leaders. Some of them are rather charismatic, good communicators, and so that's of course also attractive for attention. Even though some research for the last elections with a colleague and looking at to what extent actually transnationally individual far right or Eurosceptic in general leaders are visible, lead candidates, and there wasn't as much transnationally as you would expect. So they're really at home, they're most visible. But yeah, it's something media again like conflict, so that's something they can report about. There's a big threat they can do, and it's also not the first time. They've done it in the previous election as well and before that, so that's something that of course comes back. And we also have to, some of you mentioned it, take into account regional differences. So yes, in some countries, populist or far right may do well. In other countries, not or even less seats than in the previous national election. So that is also something we should be careful of, not to put them all under one umbrella. Of course, we do that, but it's and some of you mentioned it. There'll be differences across country.
Well, it is now time to open the floor for questions. So please, you have 2 microphones here, and you can just go and line up, and in case you can reach the microphone, and please just raise your hand.
So I work with the commerce here. It's the question I had was that when UK is marked for Brexit and it's now on life support, like last minute reprieves and extensions, how come UK was allowed to participate in European Parliament elections? Because as you can see, Nigel Farage is set to sweep, and he's a one-man demolition squad coming in and will engage in demagogy and end up like hurting the EU more than helping. And second question is that you mentioned the far right is very fragmented, but initiatives like ENF in Milan last weekend, and also like people like Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, constantly complaining that left is far more fragmented than the right is. Like, how do you actually, I guess, explain that?
On the first question, well, yeah, I mean, Ukraine is allowed to participate. It's democracy, so they can, of course, participate in elections. And as the UK as well, that was a long debate, of course, prior to the extension, whether the UK, because even though it wants to leave, wants to take part, should take part in the elections. Would that undermine the legitimacy of the EU? Yes or no? And well, the leaders have decided to let them participate. One reason for that is also because it would undermine the legitimacy if they didn't participate. If they would be a member of the EU but not take part in the European Parliament elections, there's of course the treaties which stipulate that this is basically the rule. This is how the political system at the EU level works. So they need to take part, and also Eurosceptic parties are allowed to take part. Politically, of course, that's interesting. What happens? What will they do in the type of parliament? But they've been in the parliament before, and also having their rants against the EU and institutions and other politicians. So it's also nothing new, and also politicians in Brussels are actually quite socialized and accustomed to that as well, in a way. So it's nothing which is short-term threatening, I think.
I want to add, and that's a bit provocative, I'm not sure the UK will actually leave. Because the longer it takes, the more insecure it becomes. I mean, today, if you read the news, even Theresa May kind of floats with the idea of having a second referendum. So I think it's important that they participate. Well, it's not UKIP, it's the Brexit party. I mean, Farage has created this new party that's now at 30%. But I mean, I think it's important that they participate because I think there's a relatively high chance that they will actually never leave. It's a little provocative, but I think the more we go on, and I mean, it remains to be seen if the Farage really gets 30%. I think it maybe drop a little bit closer to the election, but I think we're making conclusions without actually being sure. Because I mean, who had thought a year ago that they're still in? And maybe they're still in a year, maybe they're still in 2 years. So I think even from a political perspective, I mean, they participate and they haven't left yet, and they might never leave. I think we should also keep this in mind.
Yes, to follow up on that, and then to your second question, yeah, I mean, I think it is, I think one of the more interesting things to think about, right, in this election, right, is the fact that the UK, which I believe, I think at some point, when Halloween right now is sort of the end of October is the day we're playing with, although that's changed a bit today, I think. I think what's interesting is that, if we think that the UK will leave, obviously debate about that, the amount of resources and and campaign resources and money and all of these kinds of things that are going into running campaigns for an election in which the UK will elect members, but they will not be sitting in that institution for very long should they leave, let's say, by the end of this year. So it is a really interesting and sort of hard to, I think, wrap one's head around for how this is actually working. But what I think it is doing is that not only is it sending sort of clear signals if the Brexit Party gets 30% or 25%, right, of what perhaps the population in the UK really thinks today in 2019. The other thing that's important to mention, though, is that, you know, one of the most pro-EU parties in the UK are the Greens, and they're polling higher than they have since the late 80s, right? They're not polling anywhere near 30%, they're polling anywhere from sort of 9 to 12, 13%. But in the UK, that is, for the Greens, actually quite good, right? And they are very clearly a pro-EU party, as are the Lib Dems, that are also polling fairly well. So I think that's the other important, the flip side to this is that it's not just the 25 to 30% for the Brexit party, but that there are very clear pro-EU parties that are also polling very well and better than they have in the past. To get to your second question about the left being fragmented, which is often what one hears from the far right and from the right that it's the left, right? They're sort of throwing things back and forth to each other. The left is fragmented, right? You have the social democratic parties, you have Greens, you have the far left, which are typically not, typically more Eurosceptic. But I think the important thing in these elections is that you still have the left, the left made up of the social democrats and the socialists, even though they may lose votes, as we've talked about before, and lose seats, they still are, you know, the first or likely the second largest party that will be in party group that will be in the European Parliament. So even though that they may be somewhat fragmented, right, they still have, you know, they're still a fairly large group. And I think the discussion in terms of talking about why the far right is fragmented, is more to the point of that this group will not have that much influence because, one, they're not that big to begin with, but then they also are not in agreement. And so yes, I think both sides are fragmented, but it's a bit to do with sort of size and sort of relative threat as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the former speaker, so that's a bit boring. But I would like to raise another point that is linked a little bit, because what I remark a little bit, what I noticed a little bit from the discussion, and I think I started myself more or less, is that we very much are talking in terms of pro-EU, anti-EU. And I mean, last week a report came out, actually from our department, about how surprisingly nuanced the public opinion is, actually, at least in the Netherlands, which is, as I mentioned before, not the country in which EU debates have had a long history. But still, I mean, there's quite some evolution and quite some very nuanced opinions, with about, you know, a very small minority wanting, well, maybe less than 20% wanting to leave, and even less being enthusiast EU, pro-EU, but all kinds of very nuanced opinions in between. So that's also in the clash of Brexit, for example, and the far right and the very pro-EU parties. Let's definitely not forget that the vast majority of Europeans, probably at least in the Netherlands, are somewhere in between.
I should have mentioned that if you want to ask a question in French, I will be really happy to translate. So feel free to ask the question in your language.
Yeah, I just want to contribute a bit to the discussion of the UK, especially what Daniel was saying. The problem, I think, with the UK is its electoral system. If, in fact, it had a proportional system like elsewhere in Europe, then I think one would assume that the direction that seems to be happening, a slight opening towards staying in the EU, which we will see, I think, to some extent in the results of the parliamentary election, based on what we've seen in the polls. The problem is, how does that find its way into an election based on winning districts? The Greens might have 9% of the vote. The Liberal Party might have 12% of the vote. these are very strong pro-European parties, but they're not going to win many seats unless we have some major move in that direction. So if what could happen after this is a new election, especially if Theresa May leaves, I would sense that you could still end up with a parliament that is not in favor of staying in the EU. Now, maybe it will result in a second referendum where a more proportional result could arrive, but I still don't see that as a likely outcome given the electoral system that we have. My contribution.
Thank you. And I think the important thing to keep in mind with the UK as with France is that in the European elections it's proportional, right? So they actually in the UK I think have 8 regions, and so with that elect members to the delegations of the EP. And so this is why in the past the Greens have gotten individuals elected. Small, the SNP, the Scottish National Party in Scotland, etc. And I think you rightly point out, though, that when they may get elected in the elections and the UK votes on Thursday, they may elect Greens, Lib Dems, etc. But I think in terms of real national change, I think that will come at the next national election, which will likely be sometime, I think, later this year, in which we then revert back to the plurality system that you're all familiar with, right, and which makes it very hard for the small parties to do well. And the Greens and the Lib Dems have often, and this has been sort of their challenge, they often come in second or third because it's not proportional. And so I think you're right. I think that is a challenge, but I think that the UK is really at this moment of political change. I think we would probably all agree that Brexit, regardless of what happens with Brexit, is that we're actually seeing a really important change in the party system in the UK that's been dominated in the post-war period, for the most part, by 2 parties, and that's changing, right? And that we've seen, obviously, the Labour Party very divided. The Conservatives in the current, for the EP elections, are polling, well, anywhere from 4th to 6th, so they're not polling very well. And so I think that this is a moment where we're going to see some major change in British politics and in the party system more generally, and that even with the restrictive nature of the electoral system and the rules of the national election, that we are going to see, I think, a replacement of sort of what those 2 parties are, and it may become, more of a, well, it's not going to become sort of the multi-party system that we see in much of continental Europe because of the rules, but we may see, for example, the Lib Dems replace the Labour Party as the second largest, as one of the major parties on the sort of center-ish place in the spectrum. So I think that's an important outcome of what's been happening with Brexit, and that even regardless of what happens with Brexit and with the electoral rules, I do think that we're going to see some major shifts in British politics.
So I just wanted to ask if there are any comments on the youth vote and whether within the scope of Brexit and beyond that, the anti-fascist movements and the new far-right movements in Europe have mobilized or will be mobilizing higher rates of participation among young voters.
I think they will go both ways. I mean, young people are very much in pushing this pro-EU movement, like the pulse of Europe. But I think we will have a stronger youth turnout in favor, for example, of the Green Party. The Green Party will benefit from stronger youth turnout. But on the other hand, I think also some radical right parties, I mean, I can only talk about national elections, but they have disproportionately attracted young voters. For example, the Front National. The Front National has become from an old boys club to basically a party that disproportionately attracts young voters. So I think the young people will probably vote a little higher numbers than before. Their participation rate will still be much lower than of older generations, but there will be a little higher, and I think we'll have this higher participation both on the pro-EU forces and on the anti-EU forces.
just to follow up on that, I mean, I think that the issue, the climate issue, for example, is really mobilizing young voters. Obviously, a lot of the movements that have been in the streets in European capitals have been high school students, many of whom can't vote. But I think that that's translating into, college age voters and, younger voters as well, and that is really a very important issue, and that's what's bringing the younger voters to the polls, and that will be voting green on that side as well. Obviously, there's a different youth vote that's being mobilized on the far right as well. The other thing, just to mention, and I think in your question, that younger voters overwhelmingly voted Remain in the Brexit referendum, and so I think that again shows that a very strong sort of pro-EU, whatever that may mean, which means different things for different people, but that there is a very pro-EU sentiment among younger voters, not all, but some. So I think that will be, that Brexit as well as climate is definitely motivating and mobilizing voters that are sort of on the left.
Hi, so I have two questions that I'd like to ask. I guess one, going off of, your finding that immigration actually has kind of just fallen in terms of salience, if I've understood your findings correctly, and we've returned to the same topics that were accustomed to in elections. So I guess what I was wondering is, I bought into the whole notion of, we're seeing this huge realignment, it's not left-right anymore, it's open and close based on this big idea of national identity. Would you say that the Eurozone and the migration crisis will have actually played any sort of long-term, effect, or are we going to return to some kind of pre-2008 equilibrium, except I guess with more fragmentation as we discussed? And then the second question is, do you foresee any sort of changes in terms of how European Parliament elections will be run in the future so that they're less second order? People have European politicians are always talking about, we need to create this European demo, so European political space. Some of them have proposed, directly elected commercial president, etc. But I was wondering whether, any proposals in particular, make particular sense, and whether they have any chance of kind of getting through, or whether, it's just more convenient to just kind of muddle through the system that exists today. Thank you.
First question, everyone is thinking about proposals. I'm think about this too. So just to reiterate, so this was a public opinion survey that was done in the last few weeks. I was not part of this, but colleagues were, and it was held, just to give you a sense, in 7 countries, so Denmark, Germany, France, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and Spain. So sort of a diverse selection of countries. And in no country, there was no single issue, right, that defined what the most important issue was that voters were thinking about. And in no country did immigration come above 4th. So which is interesting, right, again, because that is perhaps not the expectation given the media, again, given sort of, the sort of political context as well. And so I think that that's important. And I think that says, again, this is just 7 of 28 countries. So, we don't want to make too much of this, but I think that it's a fairly representative sample of voters across different European countries, which is to say that not that immigration isn't important, right? On a list of 20, it's still, 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. But that voters really are thinking of other issues. And so perhaps, at this point, we might be going back to, although it's hard to say sort of a pre-2008 sort of equilibrium, but I think that we are perhaps past some of that huge spike, of course, in sort of immigration numbers, and that perhaps, although, again, I think we'll need a lot of some time to sort of analyze results and how people are voting, and then, of course, go back and ask people after the election what the most important issue was. But I do think that we're returning to a time when, to a period where there are other issues that are on the minds of voters, right? Things that, things like the economy, unemployment, etc. Now, the tricky thing is, which is always important to keep in mind, is that even though someone may not be saying immigration is one of the most important issues, immigration may be informing their opinions about the economy and trade and inequality and things like that. So And so this is always a bit of the challenge of trying to understand sort of public opinion polls. But I would say, in my opinion, I think that we are seeing a return to some of those other sort of more sort of traditional political issues, even though they may be informed by the current context, which involves immigration.
Let me ask you, we start with the second question. I think, institutions are sticky. And I think that applies rather to the EU, to the European. It's very, very hard to implement it. So I don't see any changes. But I want to nuance Jae-Jae's answer a little bit. I agree, immigration is not the most important topic anymore. But it might still be a very important topic for those who vote for that, even if it's only 20%. But for these 20%, it might still be a very, very important topic. And it also fits very well in the European context with this anti-establishment, anti-EU. And so, I mean, these often go together. So I still think before the refugee crisis, immigration was very low key. And for example, some parties like the German AfD, they were basically dead. And they profited from it. And I think what will be important for those who decided to turn to them, I mean, we have in political or in election studies, we say after you have voted 3 times for a party, you become a regular voter of this party. And I think what the danger is, and now we're reaching soon the 3rd election, and so they might establish actually a vote base. Immigration might be at the basis of this vote base, but then it's very hard to, once they have developed this regularity, call it, it's very hard to change their vote. So even if it might not be immigration anymore, but immigration was the trigger issue that made them aligned with these parties, and I think once they become regular voters, it's also very hard to tear them away. It's kind of my view.
Yeah, definitely. I think what is to add on to this, what also should be kept in mind is that these salience figures, so what is most important to voters at a particular point in time, tend to be very fickle. So they might actually change very fast. Usually not during a campaign, but then still it might because of kinds of events that might happen. Thinking about riots or terrorist attacks, or it can be any events or particular dates. So in that sense, I wouldn't read too much into that. But the second point is whether we will go back to such equilibrium. To reiterate my point earlier, I really doubt that, simply because in the eyes of the 20, perhaps 30% of Europeans who are very, very concerned about immigration and integration issues, not much has been solved probably, and such a crisis can occur again and again, blow these parties, etc. Again, blow new life into these parties at any moment. So in that sense, I think, I would not see such equilibrium coming under these circumstances. No.
Thank you. So the second question. Daniel mentioned institutions are very sticky. To elaborate, of course, the EU is very complex, and it's not only supranational institutions, also intergovernmental institutions. So, for instance, one example is every European Parliament election is publicly criticized by the media, and also voters will aware of it, for instance, that the European Parliament is a traveling circus. So it has a seat in Brussels and a seat in Strasbourg. And it's actually MEPs themselves who want to change it, but they don't have a majority for this. And actually, it's still an old agreement with France, and France insists that also one of the seats of the major institutions is in France, which otherwise wouldn't happen. We have Luxembourg, we have The Hague, we have other, Frankfurt with the ECB. So that's something the European Parliament itself cannot change. It is often wrongly accused of wasting taxpayers' money, whereas MEPs don't actually want to do that. So just to, this is just one example to see that it's not very easy to change things. Similarly with the election, direct election of the European Commission President, was a treaty change for this. For now, as good as it gets is the election through Parliament. To raise turnout, that was the intention as well. There was another idea which is not yet has not yet been implemented, is a transnational list. So when Brexit became more tangible, there were proposals by members of the European Parliament to use some of the seats distributed by two national lists, basically. But that didn't get a majority. It's also, again, I would see similar problems as currently with the least candidates that, voters cannot make sense, who's on the list, or Dutch, not a German, or Danish, or Bulgarian, why would I vote for them? I don't know them. So that's, of course, then, if it comes up again, we need to talk about these things. And in general, I think, as we've seen, more media attention, generally also that voters are aware of it. You need to show, there needs to be information that the EU is important to not only with these big crises, but also, of course, in daily life. So that is something that will naturally evolve more and more over time, and then may not be directly linked to voter turnout. We also have to bear in mind that it's, of course, not voter turnout in EU elections decline, also in national elections or regional elections, so there's fluctuation over time. So.
Yeah, I'm not asking my own questions. I'm asking a couple of questions I've been asked through Twitter. I've selected two really different questions, so that maybe different people can respond to one of them. First question is regarding the issues that are being discussed in the campaigns in the different countries for these European elections. We've talked a lot about immigration, about the environment, about Euroscepticism, but what has not been covered yet is the importance of external relations. Has there been any attention to the position of the European Union towards Russia, towards the US, towards China? Is that getting any attention at all by the parties and within this election campaign? And then the second question on a different topic is on the Spitzenkandidaten, actually, where the kind of agreement in the panel was that this probably is not going to change much, and we have to wait and see. And regardless of who's going to end up in power or be in charge of gain the majority in parliament, it's not going to change much. The question here is, do you really think it doesn't make a difference whether Manfred Weber becomes the new president of the Commission or Frans Timmermans? Does it really not matter at all, or might there be a difference there?
Start with the second question. Yes, of course, it makes a difference later on. Well, the president of the European Commission, we've seen, this is different research, but we've seen that, of course, the personalities of Commission presidents also matter for integration. So, to what extent certain laws are, or further integrations actually through the relationship with member states, also the relationship with parliament. So that also really depends a bit on the commission president. So, and of course, these two men, I mean, both men, both from founding members, they are both experienced in the EU, basically. Franz Timmermans also has national political experience. And yeah, I mean, they are both from different parties, so that will, of course, also play a role in that sense. But they are, of course, from two, what I would say is the two centrist parties, pro-European. So for voters, it may not make much difference, but later on, for the relationship between institutions, that may matter. Yeah, but also we have to see kind of majorities are there for in the council, but also in the parliament for either of the candidates.
So to the first question that was asked about the external relations, you know, I would say, and my colleague can add to this, that I don't think that external relations has really played a large role in the campaigns in terms of the relationship, with one exception, which is Russia. That it is obviously, you know, China has increasing investments in the EU with Belt and Road. Obviously, the ongoing perhaps tension between the US and the EU more generally. But my sense is that it really hasn't played that much of a role. I think really what we're seeing is really the relationship between some of these far-right parties that we've mentioned and the relationship with Russia, and how close they are, and you know, various connections and things like that. The recent scandal that has come out in Austria with the Freedom Party, and the backroom deal that was going on between the Vice Chancellor and some nieces of oligarchs in Russia over the for a newspaper, right? I think has sort of perhaps made that issue, of course, salient for Austrian voters. And I think that the issue of Russia more generally, and just sort of Russia's involvement in elections across the board, is definitely something that has become, whether not necessarily sort of an issue when voters are asked for what the most important issue is, that isn't one of them. But I think that is kind of underlying, at least among the far right parties, you know, some of that tension among those parties as well.
So my question is, do you think that the recent political scandal in Austria could impact the success of the far-right parties in the European elections?
I would say, unfortunately, not that much. I mean, again, because I can give you the example of France. It's not really reported, so I don't think it really helps or it really hurts the Front National. I think it has an impact in Austria for sure, but Austria has very few seats, so I think they have 2 right now, the FPÖ, so if it goes down to 1, that doesn't change a lot. In Germany, I think it might have a small influence. Because Germany is very much reported, it was German newspaper who broke the scandal. But I think in Germany, the AfD, instead of like 13, 15%, which we are hoping, maybe they go under 10. But I think that's the most impact, and even I'm not sure, but that's the most impact it could have.
Yeah, I think I'm also very skeptical for 2 reasons. One is that I think to find out whether such a thing has an effect, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of a voter for these parties. And well, the 3 main issues on the basis of which Europeans vote for anti-immigration parties are immigration, and immigration. So if you're like very much concerned about immigration, do you then, I mean, then the question becomes, of course, okay, to what extent do you care that some politician turns out to be corrupt? Many of these people think that most politicians are corrupt anyway, or that he's framed or something like that. So in that sense, I don't think. So that would be my first point, to be very skeptical about really big effects on far right would-be voters. And the second reason is we did a study in the Netherlands where we looked at the association. So if you associate particular parties, it was PVV and also for the Forum for Democracy, with parties such as Front National at the time, FPE, Vlaams Belang, what did that actually do? And it turns out that voters in the Netherlands, at least, think that or assume that Front National, FPE, Vlaams Belang, that these are extreme right, largely homophobic parties, etc. Even if they don't think that their own PVV or Forum for Democracy is right. So it worked very stigmatizing. So in the sense that if you told far right voters that PVV and Forum for Democracy were actually close friends with FPE and Marine Le Pen, etc., they basically backed up. So they reduced their perceived legitimacy of the PVV in this particular case, and of the Forum for Democracy too. And it reduced also their propensity to vote for them. Which basically means that, there's a lot of Europeans, probably, at least in the Netherlands, that whatever they for themselves vote, still think that these anti-immigration parties, such as FPE in another country, are really like, we don't want to have anything to do with them. So that's the second reason to be very skeptical. But probably many Europeans, other countries, even if they're very much concerned about immigration, do not want to have anything to do with FPE, and therefore a corruption scandal in the FPE will probably not have much effect.
Hi, bonsoir. Johannes Müller-Gomez, the Université de Montréal. I would have two issues I would like to raise to come back. First, the question Ruth just mentioned, and to which Katjana answered, about the difference between the two candidates. And I think there are several Europeans in the room, and I think we really would capture people that really would make the difference. It's a difference whether we've got Weber at the Commission or whether we've got Timmermans, an enthusiastic European, passionate feminist in favor of climate action. Weber, not very charismatic, somehow finds himself in a dilemma between he's pro-European at the same time he's a friend of Orban. He doesn't want to lose votes on the right. So I would like to really hear your opinion on that. What do you think? What can be Timmermans and Weber's impact on future Commission, and to which extent do you think they can have really an impact in the direction to which Europe is going to develop in the next 5 years? Second point, you mentioned the rise of right-wing parties, the low turnout we can expect for the next elections. Well, we mentioned it's Christmas today, and we've got one wish, how to reform the European Union. What do you think, or is there like one thing we should absolutely do to reform the European Union to make it more attractive to people, to encourage people to use their vote, to maybe also to somehow contribute to reduce your skepticism among EU citizens? You mentioned already transnational list, the direct election of the European Commissioner, the President of the European Commission. is there one thing you really would say that's the most important reform we have to implement in the next 5 years?
Who wants to start with the Christmas wish?
Well, my Christmas wish at first phase, excellent question actually, would simply be more democracy. I mean, with the capital D. That is the bottom line, I think, of everything. More transparency, more democracy, more of political conflict, and showing what is really at stake, and try to engage voters by actual power and actual power clashes. I think that is what is lacking most in the EU politics at this moment.
More concretely, maybe, like more democracy, yes, but how?
Well, you asked me my wish, right? I mean, when I can get to do a wish, I'm asked like how. But I will think about it.
I think the first question, it really depends what happens. I mean, the last 5 years was basically crisis mode. We had the financial crisis, and then we had the refugee crisis. And it took up most of the time. If we have 5 years without crisis, I think it can make a difference with who is Commission President. But they can push a little bit their own agenda. For the second question, I would say more integration. I mean, I think, the problem is right now we have like asymmetrical immigration. For example, I would like to have a European army. I would like to have a European foreign policy. And I think that my wish would be that the pro-European forces have the courage also to overcome national boundaries. Let's say when it comes to an army, when it comes to, for example, why do several countries need atomic weapons? I mean, it's enough if the European Union has one arsenal itself. Why does France needs to have their own? So I think that if states really walk the walk, and even go, I would say, answer this Euroscepticism by more integration and show that more cooperation is possible in other fields as well. I think that's kind of a little bit the crux we are in. There's a lot of cooperation in some fields, but very much lack of cooperation in others. And I think to really show that the European Union can carry the project one step further.
Yeah, it's because, I mean, I agree with both of you that there's, of course, a lot has to be done still and developed. On the one hand, from a researcher perspective, it makes it very exciting to study something which is still evolving. Every time we think, okay, what can I get here? What can happen next? What are possible consequences? That's very exciting. So, but on the other hand, as an EU citizen, I of course also I wouldn't ask generally for more democracy. I mean, it's a democratic system. That is from the procedures are there. What you are missing is perhaps a bit of more conflict or media attention also. So that's something that needs to be solved. So with journalists, but also then I would ask voters to be more interested in it. So that would be perhaps a wish. But coming back to your question about the two candidates, well, I was answering from a voter perspective, because for voters who've never heard of them, it is a big answer. And I have to say, they are of course both pro-EU, even though of course there were the issues with Fidesz in the party and stuff, but still he's a pro-European candidate for a pro-European party. He may have different ideas from Timmermans, but in that sense, they don't differ on that aspect. They of course come from different parties. We also have to remember that once you're Commission President, you become a bit more neutral. You can of course have your agenda in terms of what do we want to tackle in the next few years, and who do we select as fellow commissioners on the cabinet. But it's not like a national government where we could say, okay, for the next 5 years, it's youth unemployment that we want to work on, and only that. Of course, they will also tackle that, but they don't have the leeway to decide that themselves only. They can help other institutions developing it together. But it's not the president of the United States, for instance, who, has really the legislative power there. So in that sense, one may be more likable than the others to some voters, but it's really not nothing to impact.
So to go back to your Christmas question, which was a really great question. I've been sitting here thinking, as everyone has been talking, and trying to come up with something really provocative, which haven't really. Because I think it's an important question, and I think I would say, as Joost said, that that if I had a wish for how to improve the European Union, would be to increase transparency and make it less complicated, right? I think the fact that we have the Council, the Commission, the Parliament, right? It is very complicated, right? And now we have a candidate that's being elected as the leading candidate of the party in the Parliament that's going to be then the Commission president, and it's perhaps not clear what the Commission does relative to the Council, et cetera, right? And so I think that complicates things, and that takes away from sort of small d democracy or large d democracy, right? And if the idea of reforming the EU and to make it more democratic, not that it's not, but if we think that democracy, and again, this a bit comes with what you think democracy, right? Is democracy sort of clear understanding of how the institutions work? Is it higher levels of turnout, right? We talked about the low levels of voter turnout, right? And I don't think it's actually been mentioned in all of what we've said, but the turnout in the last election was about 43%. In the first election, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about 62, 63%, right? So we have seen somewhat this sort of steady decline, just to put sort of that in perspective. But sort of obviously there's a reason for that, right? And there's all sorts of research that's talked about why you have a founding election, lots of turnout at first, and then it goes down getting towards the end, not to get into that. But I think that, again, I think it depends what we think about sort of what more democracy looks like. I would say that it means we can use sort of more democracy and increase turnout and increase knowledge and perhaps make things less complicated. How we do that and how we perhaps eliminate a set of institutions, I don't know if we could even go that far, again, at this point in sort of European project and integration, but I think that would sort of go a long way to reaching some of these goals of democracy, increased transparency. That's in 5 minutes when I'm thinking about it. That's a very important question.
Yeah, to come back to my elaboration on the how of the wish, I think at least 2 points that I will also wish for national Dutch democracy. I worked in Parliament for a while, and then I think two measures are clearly very important. One is much more transparency in terms of finance and also party finance, for example. But second, and perhaps most important, is much more power for Parliament, both in terms of actual institutional, really like having even more power vis-a-vis the executive, and also in terms of simply staffing, right, of support staff. As at least the Dutch Parliament is permanently understaffed. Not sure about the European Parliament, but it's probably not bad to give some more resources there too. But then again, on final note, I mean, we're talking about the startup democracy, startup institution. So in that sense, do not expect wishes to come true very fast.
Well, it's very optimistic note. Maybe we should reconvene in like 40 years so that we can evaluate whether the patient or not. Well, I would like to thank the audience for the very interesting questions. Also the virtual audience through Twitter. Now that this event is coming to an end, I would also like to thank the Jean Monnet Centre Montreal team and the Centre for the Study of Democracy team for the organization. I would also like to acknowledge the three funding agencies without which this event would not have been possible. So the Fonds de recherche du Québec pour la Société, électorale, the Canadian Social Science and Humanity Research Council, and the Erasmus Plus program for the European Commission. Obviously, I also would like to thank our four panelists for this insightful discussion, and please join me in a row of applause to thank them.